Okay, welcome to the latest of our series in the International Legitimacy Talks. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Mor Mitrani from the Department of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University. Dr Mitrani, I just wanted to talk to some of the themes from your paper that you're presenting this afternoon. The title of the paper is Who's In and Who's Out? The International Community as a De-Legitimization Device. And I want to start just by probing a little bit this idea of the international community as a discursive construct. Can you tell us a little bit about what you meant by that?
Sure, but maybe I'll start with telling you how did I come to the idea of thinking about this project. So while I did my PhD, I read a lot of these UN speeches that my project is exploring. And I was focusing on completely different concepts. But then I realized that these leaders that come to the UN and in every year speak on behalf of the states, kind of always talk about the international community. And as an international relations scholar, I was sitting in my, next to my computer and asking, what is this international community? I have no idea what it is, and I have no theoretical tools to understand this concept. And then I figure out that this is interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon to explore, and I started a now 4-year project that tried to understand who is the international community. And what I'm suggesting is basically that the international community is exactly what states are talking about. That you can't understand the concept without understanding that it materializes once we talk about it. It doesn't exist outside of the discourse. You can't email the international community, it has no building. You can't ask it to act, although we keep on calling it to act. So in my journey to understand who is the international community, I suggest that the best way to answer this question is actually to explore how actors are talking about it. And after doing it, I came to a conclusion that the main role or political function of this concept is actually to use it as a legitimation, or more precisely as a de-legitimation device. So states use this concept, the words, the phrase international community, in order to draw boundaries of rightful conduct in the international arena, and also to single out and target states that deviate from this sphere of legitimate action. And in this case, it has both a notional role in terms of the concept and the context in which it is being used, give us the content of what is legitimate, but also a normative framework that helps us or helps states to be very clear on who is in and who is out. So that's basically my argument.
Okay, we're sitting in a law school. I have a legal background, and when you think of the international community as lawyers, we have this particular understanding that it is something that in some way presupposes international law. So, from a lawyer's point of view, the international community is something, it's almost like a fiction that it is necessary for international law to exist, right? So I was curious about how you kind of juxtapose or contrast your understanding of the international community with that idea, that it is somehow a static set of actors that constitute the international system, as it were, and that constitute international law, even if it is a fiction, of course, and lawyers accept that it is usually a fiction, but it's a necessary fiction for us to make sense of international law, for us to make sense of an international legal system. So how do you fit or contrast your understanding of the international community with that particular legalistic understanding?
So I would argue that to a great extent, the international law perspective on international community is circular. So you have to have a community in order to have international law, but you have international law in order to reinforce the rules of the community. So what started what? Because if it wasn't a fiction, it was easier, because then you first have the community, and the community set the law. but at the international level, we don't have it. So if you invent the fictional international community only in order to make sense of the international law, who is the community? And it's fine, and I completely accept the need of international lawyer and of theorists of international law to have this fiction. But it still doesn't explain, or it's not sufficient to explain, why political actors keep on referring to this international community in contexts that are not necessarily tied to international law. So what I'm trying to say is that I completely accept the use of international community as a concept in international law theory, but I think that it's a very, very, very narrow way to understand the concept itself, and also because it really misses its political function, which I think are more substantive than its legal functions.
So you talked a little bit about the idea of international community setting a sort of a standard or benchmark against which we can adjudicate the action, particularly of states, right? So based on what you said, is it your view then that that standard changes depending on the context? Is it the case that when the international community is invoked, say in the United Nations, is this a new standard that state actions are being adjudicated by or held accountable to? Or is it the case, do you see that there's any continuity in the use of international community in different contexts, like the types of contexts you talk about in your paper? Because obviously, again, as a lawyer, when we talk about norms or standards, we have a sense that there's a continuity here, there's a stability. Again, going to the idea of maybe a law, maybe. Or is it the case, in your view, that because it's used sometimes strategically, sometimes opportunistically, that actually the norms that are being invoked or the standards that are being invoked vary according to the context and the usage?
So I would say both. And this is what my findings tell me. Because what I do in the research itself is trying to be completely agnostic. Okay, I don't know what is the international community, and I'm not trying to presuppose the normative or the practices that it comes with. But rather, what I did is I took 4,500 speeches in the UN, and I asked a software to tell me what states are talking about when they talk about the international community. And we have now all these sophisticated tools that allows me to do nothing and just brings me back nice tables. And the very nice table that I got showed me that the answer to your question is both. So when states speak about international community, they tend to speak about 10 topics, more or less, that are connected to the idea of the community. And these 10 topics are quite intuitive, but I found it very interesting, because again, it gives me as a researcher a view on the content of international relations, of how states, through discursive interactions, actually make the relations. And when states talk with themselves, about themselves in the United Nations General Debate, they assign the international community context that tell us what bothers them. So they talk a lot about security and about democracy and about specific geopolitical areas of the world like Africa and the Middle East, and in some areas about Bosnia. And you can see that some of these topics are completely stable. Some of these topics vary over time. For example, at some point in time, states started to talk about climate change when they talk about the international community. Our theory can't explain that, because climate change has nothing to do with international relations. But states decided, or again, it's not like this decision that they set together and say, we should talk about climate change when we talk about international community. But at some point in time, around 2006, states started to present ecological issues at the United Nations General Debate, and they started to talk about it in the context of international community. And I'm trying to ask myself, what does it tell me? It tells me that states took upon themselves as this fictional collective also the responsibility to take care for climate change, which, again, in IR traditional theory, has nothing to do with states' responsibility. And this is a political change that the way I'm trying to employ my research gives me a view on political dynamics that otherwise I wouldn't be able to actually grasp.
Okay. Can I ask you a little bit about the role that then the international community plays in this broader concept of international legitimacy, which is the title of our project? If we think of, to give a definition, if we think of international legitimacy as a way in which actors or maybe systems or institutions enhance their own acceptance to those over whom they're trying to govern in whatever way, right? So it's about fostering buy-in, as it were, from actors, getting them to come along with whatever it is you're trying to do. To what extent does the invocation of international community then help and hinder that, right? So do you think the way, for example, from your research, the way that international community has been invoked in the United Nations has helped generally foster more buy-in with what international actors do, and particularly we would say probably the UN Security Council, or do you think it more creates resistance against what the UN is trying to do, or whatever kind of action is going on in the name of the international community? How does that square with the idea of legitimacy? Do you think it helps the legitimation of particular acts, or actually it's corrosive or undermines the legitimacy?
Well, like the answer to this question, I think 90% of questions on this topic is depends, right? And it depends first on how optimistic or pessimistic you want to be about world politics, and I prefer to be optimistic. And so from here, I will say, from this point of trying to be optimistic, I would say that in the end of the day, especially if I'm trying to argue that the international community is a legitimacy device, it is important, the concept is important in order for states to actually imagine themselves as members of a greater collective. And again, IR theory can't explain it. It can't explain why states bother every year to speak about themselves as part of a greater collective. We don't supposed to do that. States supposed to be alienated against each other. They're supposed to think about their self-interest and about their own survival. And we have no tools to think of a greater collective, let alone about a community, which is a very, very solid collective. And again, states all the time talk about themselves as members of a greater collective. And I think that they need this in order to have some kind of order in international politics, in order to know, okay, think about this imagined international community, right? You can't exclude states. You can't come to North Korea and say, okay, you can't be a member of this club anymore. You just can't. But you need to have these words that helps you to say, hey, you're a naughty member. We have nothing to do against you, but we want you to know that you're a naughty member. And this naughty member also use the same concept in order to say, I'm not that naughty. For example, when I read the speeches of North Korea in the United Nations, you say, okay, why does a state like North Korea bothers to come every year to the General Assembly, to talk every year, and to present itself as a democratic state that promotes human rights? And we all know that it's not the case, right? So we are not arguing if North Korea is a democratic state that promotes human rights. I'm just intrigued by the fact that it bothers to present itself as a democratic state that promotes human rights. And that tells me how strong the concept is. Because if a state that really has no interest in being part of the international community understands the strength, the normative strength of being a democratic state that promotes human rights to the extent that it bothers to present itself as such, gives me hope that maybe, like it is strong enough to unite states as a collective.
Okay, that's a great segue to my next question, which is what is perceived, at least in the West, as a crisis of international legitimacy in some sense, right? And this is connected to the wave of populism sweeping constitutional democracies. Populism, of course, is not new. What's perhaps new is that it's present in stable constitutional democracies that seem to have managed to resist populist movements in the past. And we see from this kind of wave of populism challenges to what's often referred to as the international rules-based order. So we're sitting in the UK, of course, it's decided to leave the European Union, which is one of the kind of beacons of the international rules-based order. Also in the US, of course, with Trump talking about the WTO and tariffs and all this kind of thing. And there's a sense in which, you know, the international rules-based order is in crisis. And we're trying to predict where this ends up. Does this mean that the international rules-based order is going to change? Does it mean it's going to fall apart? Is it going to fragment? And so I'm just wondering about your views on what role legitimacy has to play there. And also in particular, do you think the idea of an international community will have a role to play in the future? Because in some senses, what it seems to suggest is that this idea of international community just doesn't exist, right? There isn't buy-in from states, right? They're saying, no, our sovereignty is important and we cannot be restrained in this way and we should be able to do America first, all this kind of stuff. So seeing that you said you're an optimist, do you see maybe that we can see an international community developing in the future in a more robust sense, that this maybe will help with some of the crises we're undergoing? Or do you think, obviously it's important to predict the future, but what role do you think international community and legitimacy can play in this current instability being introduced into international rules-based order from this wave of populism?
So I'll tell you what I did exactly 2 years ago. So the general debate, which is my main data set, it takes place every year in September. And exactly 2 years ago, I sat in the sofa in my house, and I was waiting for Donald Trump to come to give his first speech to the UN General Assembly. And I told myself, this is the speech that would determine if your academic career is about to end or if it has a future. Because my entire academic career is actually based on arguing that there is some kind of international community. And President Trump went up to the podium and he gave the most internationalist, optimistic speech that I can think of. And he talked about the importance of the United Nations and about the willingness of the US to keep its role as a leader and as a founder of the United Nations, and about the importance of international cooperation. And I didn't believe a word, but I do believe in the power of conformity. So at the end of the day, things are changing, and change is a really good thing, but they're not falling apart. And to some extent, I would even argue that this concept of international community is a good anchor that states use in order to, again, find some kind of order in the turmoil that happens in world politics, and it always happens, right? Like it's not that 2019 is less ordered than 1945 or 32. Okay, so world politics is a mess. It's been a mess for centuries, and states are looking for anchors that help them to make some sense of this mess. And for me, international community, especially as a legitimacy device, is a really good anchor. It doesn't mean that things are stable or constant, no, but it means that we can always infuse new content into this discursive vessel, and to use it in order to remind ourselves that it's helpful to think of world politics as in a collective manner, despite and maybe because of conflicts and constatations. So again, I will take the optimistic.
Great, and on that optimistic note, we can leave it there. Dr. Mitrani, thank you so much today.